we have some interesting stuff to talk about regarding Bernie Sanders. He recently gave a speech where he boasted about his support for democratic socialism and the fact that he's a democratic socialist. He gave a long, like 45 or hour-long speech, and I just wanted to kind of talk about that with you guys. It was covered, obviously, extensively by the media. I found an article from Politico which talks about it, and this one is from the 12th, June 12th of this month, yeah. And it says, the title is Sanders Goes Full FDR in Defense of Democratic Socialism. It says, Bernie Sanders argued Wednesday that the United States is at a moment as urgent as the one it found itself in during the 1930s. Authoritarianism and oligarchy are on the march across the world, he said, and the best way to defeat them is with an emphatic break from the mainstream politics of either party. In a major campaign speech designed to counter critics of his democratic socialist ideology, the Vermont senator proposed a 21st century economic bill of rights that would ensure the right to a decent job, health care, affordable housing, higher education, secure retirement, and a clean environment. Sanders, whose family members were killed in the Holocaust, also reminded audience members that tens of thousands of Nazis gathered in 1939, not in Berlin, not in Rome, but in Madison Square Garden in front of a 30-foot tall banner of George Washington bordered with swastikas. But instead of falling for fascism, he said Americans followed the path of New Deal liberalism. He rejected the ideology of Mussolini and Hitler. We rejected the ideology of Mussolini and Hitler. We instead embraced the bold and visionary leadership of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he said. Together with organized labor, leaders in the African American community, and progressives outside the party, Roosevelt led a transformation of the American government and the American economy. It says Sanders drew a line between the Nazis who gathered in New York City in 1939 to the neo-Nazis who marched in Charlottesville in 2017. At the same time, he tied himself to Roosevelt. One of his biggest applause lines came when he recalled a well-known campaign speech that Roosevelt delivered in 1936. Sanders repeated Roosevelt's famous words that he had to struggle against quote, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering, and other foes. Never before in all of our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. Yeah, that last line where he says, I welcome their hatred is a famous line from FDR. Specifically that part where everybody kind of loves that part. And I mean, I remember Bernie's repeated, I think he repeated it in 2016 as well, when he was going after like Wall Street and, big corporations and stuff. It says the audience erupted, chanting Bernie, Bernie, Bernie. Some of them wore red t-shirts boasting Sanders' proposed Medicare for all. Sanders replied, I must say, it does sound a little contemporary, doesn't it? It says, the rest of this next paragraph, it says, the independent presidential candidate also used the speech to tie himself to the Democratic Party, rattling off numerous examples of times that Democratic presidents, from FDR to John F. Kennedy to Bill Clinton, were derided as socialists. And he said that in embracing a new quote, economic bill of rights, like FDR proposed shortly before he died, he was trying to complete the unfinished business of the Democratic Party. Today, our Bill of Rights guarantees the American people a number of constitutionally protected political rights, Sanders said. Now, we must take the next step. Next step forward and guarantee every man, woman, and child in our country basic economic rights. The right to quality of health care, the right to as much education as one needs to succeed in our society, the right to a decent job, the right to affordable housing, the right to secure retirement, and the right to live in a clean environment. It says, in trying to tie his campaign to Roosevelt, Sanders was also making an implicit argument about his electability, a question mark that's hovered over both his campaigns for president. FDR and his progressive coalition created the New Deal, won 4 terms, and created an economy that worked for all and not just the few. So yeah, it's really interesting to see Bernie, going that strong in, kind of trying to put his vision out there and trying to make sure people know that it's democratic socialism is something he's going to champion, because he didn't do this in 2016 when he railed against other people and said democratic socialism is the better model than whatever shitty corporate capitalism that we have going on. A lot of times he wasn't really able to lay it out there as a policy speech. It didn't seem to, at least, or at least that's not how it, I don't think that's how it connected to most people. Connected with most people. Most people saw him when they saw him kind of saying these things, as far as addressing the issue of kind of the ideology of democratic socialism, most of it consisted of him defending it, and not really going on the offensive and saying this is the way, this is the way we should go, and this is the better policy, and this is what I believe in. And I think it's just more of him going on the offensive and making sure people understand what these policies, what the policies behind democratic socialism involve. And I don't think he really thought it through before in 2016. Obviously, his policies aren't any different. It's not a matter of what policies are different. It's the explanation that you have to give. So when you have to give in a specific explanation about, why, why is democratic socialism the better ideology? A lot of it was just this is a policy that has worked out really well in Scandinavia. It's worked out really well in countries like Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Finland, which is true. I mean, that's a perfectly normal thing to say when you're explaining it to people that are on the fence about it. But when you are talking to people that don't know what democratic socialism is, you have to kind of simplify it a little bit more. I mean, dare I say, even dumb it down a little bit, to the extent that you have to give people almost like a history lesson. So that's what he did here. He explained how, during the 1930s, authoritarianism and oligarchy were taking over, and then people kind of went against that, and then FDR came in, and then he was pushing for things like, decent jobs and healthcare, affordable housing, higher education, stuff like that, better environment and stuff. So to kind of mesh FDR into his explanation, talking about how people weren't in favor of the Nazis and Hitler and all that stuff that were, obviously Hitler wanted to take over the world. He was already taking over Germany. Obviously, he was defeated thanks to the United States and the UK and Winston Churchill and all that stuff. But and that was obviously during that during World War II. But it's one of those things where sometimes you have to kind of lecture people when you're introducing them to something that they don't know about. And when you're forced to, when you are forced to give those kind of long speeches, you got to make sure you're explaining it in concise ways and laying it out for people to really understand it better, instead of just pretending you're talking to a bunch of people that are following politics, that follow politics all the time. So it's like I said, you have to dumb it down a little bit. You have to simplify it. You have to make sure that people that are maybe not all that familiar with politics, or maybe not as familiar with politics, kind of in that camp, you have to make sure that those people understand it a hell of a lot better than the rest of us who are, who know who Bernie Sanders is. We follow politics. We're progressives. We know that the things that, democratic socialism is going to push for, because when you talk about democratic socialism and you say it's going to push for things like, higher wages and, better healthcare and, good education and, the kind of things that are in all those other industrialized nations, like Scandinavian countries, European countries like Germany and, stuff like England is another one of them, the UK and stuff. Yeah. Like those kind of countries, they like those people when those people hear about maybe not so much democratic socialism, but they hear about the ideas that Bernie Sanders is putting forth and calling it democratic socialism. People in those other industrialized nations that I just mentioned, those people understand what Bernie is saying. To them, it's like a duh. It's like, oh, well, of course, we have better education here. We have a system that gives us, good health care. We don't have to pay, hundreds of thousands of dollars to, let's say, get surgery, when we need it, get an operation when we need it, putting our kids through college, all that stuff, like that's not something that's a worry in those countries. They have everything figured out there because they're way ahead of us in our understanding of these policies. And unfortunately, a lot of the policies that we kind of have right now in this country right now, is a lot of it has just been centered around, what somebody like Ronald Reagan was pushing for. So when Ronald Reagan was president, he was president from 1980 to 1988, and he won pretty much both of his presidential campaigns, his presidential, elections pretty much with ease. First time was against Jimmy Carter. Second time was against, I believe it was Walter Mondale, and he just dominated. I mean, he went into those elections with just the just ridiculous amount of confidence, and he knew what he was doing. He knew the message that he was pushing. Obviously, he had very good advisors who knew, what he stood for, and knew how to make sure people understand, people hear him and understand what he's saying. And a lot of those times, everything was, a lot of those things, we had much lesser media, obviously, because these days we have social media, we have, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all these different things. We have all these different political, not political, but we have all these different outlets that, politics can be discussed on. Whereas if you're going back, what is it, almost 4 decades ago, 3 or 4 decades ago, people obviously, even 2 decades ago, social media wasn't around. But when you're discussing what was going on 4 decades ago, it was much different than what it is now. And, you could talk to just like a few amount of people, and then they would just get the word of mouth around about this Ronald Reagan guy, and then everybody would be like, wow, Ronald Reagan, yeah, he's totally the way to go. While, these Democrats, and honestly back then, the Democrats were pretty bad. Jimmy Carter was our last best president, for sure, as far as Democratic president. He wasn't great, but he was the last decent Democrat to be out there. And considering a number of shitty Democrats we've had, which is basically Obama and then Clinton before him, that was the last 2 Democrats we had. All the ones before that were Reagan, like I said, George W. Bush, and then now we have Trump. And, obviously the choices have always been shitty, but among the Republican choices, obviously those are shitty. But when you're talking about Democratic choices, the last 2 choices have been horrible. And when you consider that to be the fact, the fact of how bad those guys are, Jimmy Carter is definitely one of the better ones, for sure. At least in recent memory, in modern history, if you want to consider that modern history. But Carter was definitely good in many cases. He wasn't great, though. But when it comes to being as far as not sticking to, by the way, Jimmy Carter was a Bernie supporter too. He voted for him in 2016 too. So that, I think that tells you a lot about where, how smart that guy is. But what I was going to say is that when you're considering the kind of Democrats that are going to stand firm on issues and say, this is where I am. This is what I stand for. This is who I am. This is what I'm going to be. These are the policies that I'm going to advocate. And, I'm going to make sure to make your life better. I'm going to make sure to make your family's life better, your kids, your grandkids, grandkids, grandparents, everybody. Everybody's going to have a much better life, under, this, my possible, my potential presidency and stuff. Like when you can have somebody going out there saying that kind of stuff, like you can really put a lot of confidence into those people to make sure they believe that you are on their side. And honestly, a lot of times that's not what presidents do. Now, one thing that you can give Donald Trump credit for is that Donald Trump has the ability to get people's attention and get people to listen to what he's saying. Now, as stupid and ridiculous as Donald Trump sounds 99% of the time, either way, he's able to get people's eyes and ears. He's able to get he has the ability to get you to hear what he has to say, even if what he says sounds stupid. But at the end of the day, as long as you're listening to him, whether or not you agree or disagree, as long as you're listening to him, that's a big win for him. And for somebody like Trump, the thing about Trump is all about marketing. To him, it's like even negative marketing, negative attention is good attention for him, because at least he's getting people to listen to him, and he's getting people to hear what he has to say, even if they don't agree, because at least maybe in some way he can get them to agree. And I think a great example of Bernie Sanders doing that is when Bernie Sanders went to Fox News. And a lot of Democrats didn't want him to go to Fox News, and then a couple of Democrats did end up going to Fox News, and then nobody said shit, because when Bernie went, they trashed him like crazy and said, "How dare you go to Fox News, and how dare you do that?" Even Elizabeth Warren didn't go on there, and she said it was Fox News is a hate for profit channel or whatever. We're going to be discussing Elizabeth Warren in a bit, but I just wanted to put that out there. But one example of Bernie trying to reach out to people and trying to get people to listen to what he has to say is definitely when he went to Fox News, for sure. And the fact that he wanted to get people that maybe don't agree with him to listen to him and hear him out and see what he has to say, and try to convince them that he can give them something that Donald Trump is not giving them, because obviously all they're doing is listen to Donald Trump and other Republicans. So at least for once, get an actual progressive on there, an actual, Democratic Socialist on there. And if you want to, agree with him, fine. You want to disagree with him, that's fine too. But at least you'll hear him. And it turns out when he went on there, the audience that was listening to him at that town hall, even with all the questions that he was getting peppered with by the Fox News, anchors or hosts or whatever, that were kind of quarterbacking that town hall, even with all those questions that he was getting, he was still going on there and he was spitting fire. He was getting people to hear him out. And what did they do? They cheered for him. They clapped for him. The audience gave him a standing ovation multiple times, if I remember correctly. And he did a great job. And this is something that other Democrats need to take note of, because at the end of the day, you are running for president for the entire country. You're not running for president for just like New York or California or Texas, or what I'm saying? Like, you're not just running on one side. You got to run for all the people in the middle too, all the Ohios and Iowas and Nebraskas and in the deep South, the Louisianas, Alabamas, all that shit. South Carolina. These are all people. These are all areas of the country that people, every area of the country basically has, are going to have people that aren't going to like certain presidents. They're not going to approve of Bernie Sanders. They're not going to approve of, Hillary Clinton. Some are not going to approve of Donald Trump, whether, no matter where you're from. Obviously, like the middle of the country was very much more in support of Donald Trump in 2016, whereas the more of the, different kind of like the different coasts of the country, which were much more in favor of Hillary Clinton. So when it comes to Bernie Sanders, he knows what to do. He knows he shouldn't be using the same formula as Hillary Clinton, as the same formula as any of these centrist Democrats are doing right now. These neoliberal centrists who just want to just cater to the corporate interests and then put out a bunch of ideas that are just milquetoast ideas, essentially. So let me just play you guys a clip of Bernie Sanders. So that speech from Bernie Sanders, it's just it's kind of like a short breakdown. It's, I guess, a couple of like the sound bites, essentially. We don't have enough time to play the entire address, which is like 45 minutes long. I'll post that for you. I'll post that clip for you guys, the full length speech in the description box below. But just check out this short clip of him, of his full parts of his speech right here. Check it out.
I do understand that I and other progressives will face massive attacks from those who attempt to use the word socialism as a slur. But I should also tell you that I have faced and overcome these attacks for decades, and I am not the only one. Now, let us be very clear. While President Trump and his fellow oligarchs attack us for our support of democratic socialism, they don't really oppose all forms of socialism. They may hate democratic socialism because it benefits working people, but they absolutely love corporate socialism that enriches Trump and other billionaires. Our job 75 years later is to complete what Roosevelt started. And that is why today I am proposing a 21st century economic Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights that establishes once and for all that every American, regardless of his or her income, is entitled to the right to a decent job that pays a living wage, the right to quality health care, the right to a complete education, the right to affordable housing, the right to a clean environment, and the right to a secure retirement.
So those are all great things from Bernie Sanders. That is just music to my ears. That's something that, I always hear from Bernie Sanders. It's nothing new. Definitely nothing, new for any progressive out there that is familiar with Bernie and knows the kind of things he's going to say and expects him to obviously go, a certain way with his rhetoric and, basically kind of like, the message that he's going to convey is always going to be that kind of message, and I respect him for that, and that's great. I mean, and I love that he calls, because in the speech he called Trump a corporate socialist, and he benefits off of corporate socialism. He said that here in this little clip here, and that's great. I mean, that's a great way to put it. And that reminded me actually of one of my favorite hosts from back in the day, back when MSNBC was decent. A great progressive that used to host a show on there was his name was Dylan Ratigan, and he has a book, and the book is right here. I have it right on my shelf here, and the title of that book is Greedy Bastards: How We Can Stop Corporate Communists, Banksters, and Other Vampires from Sucking America Dry. I mean, that's a great title. Not only greedy bastards, but stop the corporate communists. So the same thing, kind of similar, the same thing as Bernie says, corporate socialists. So that's a great way to put it, because not only, basically when it comes to that, that label, basically what you're saying is that these corporate oligarchs are using the government, the rigged government, essentially, to benefit them and get all that money, whether it's tax cuts, whether it's cutting of Social Security, so like different entitlement programs, cutting the taxes for millionaires and billionaires, all that stuff ends up going all the way to all those, super rich donors and, political operatives and all those people that are already rich in this country, politicians who end up getting funded by those donors and stuff. So it's like everything, it's all like that flow of the, that flow of just ridiculous amounts of money ends up just going all the way to the rich. So what do? You socialize it so that you make sure it goes to the super rich and the millionaires and billionaires. The same people that Bernie has been railing against his entire career, whether it was in 2016, 2012, 2008, all those times. All these years he's been doing it. He's still doing it to this day. He gets mocked for it, but I mean that's what you're supposed to do. That's what when you're a democratic socialist, you're a progressive like Bernie Sanders. That's the kind of stuff you do. And to be fair, there's another way of describing Bernie's worldview is a social democrat. So believing in a social democracy. That's kind of another way. Like democratic socialism and social democracy are kind of similar, but like Kyle Klinsky of Secular Talk mentions many times that Bernie is much more of a social democrat than a democratic socialist. But those two terms, like I said, they're kind of interchangeable. So you don't really, I don't know, I wouldn't really gripe with like, oh, well, you have to use this term and use that term. I'm not really like a big person that worries about specific labels when it comes to like what I call myself or what I call that person. Like, it's more about the specific policies that matter. So if you're like a neoliberal or you're a centrist, just point out the policies. Like, just calling them a neoliberal and calling them centrist isn't enough. You have to go into the detail of what they believe and the things that they say and the positions that they take. And yeah, Bernie is definitely, a social democrat, democratic socialist, and he's a progressive. And that's why I love him, and that's why I'm going to vote for him again in 2020, just like I did in 2016 in the primary, and hopefully when and if he becomes the nominee and he runs against Trump too.